Okay. So I'm Colin Spoelman. I'm one of the founders and the master distiller of Kings County Distillery, which is the oldest distillery in New York City, but is only 4 years old. So it is not a historical institution by any measure. It is the first distillery in the city since Prohibition, but often people come up and say, well, I associate distilling with Kentucky and Tennessee. And one of the products that we make is bourbon, and people say, are you even allowed to make bourbon outside of Kentucky? Isn't that a law? And in fact, no, it's not. It's just a myth. When I first got interested in distilling, part of what, and especially distilling in the city, I got sort of interested in kind of excavating the history of distilling in New York City. And in fact, starting to look at that history, it's incredibly rich. And in fact, the oldest distillery in the United States of America, or the first distillery in the United States of America, was in New York City in 1640. It was set up by Willem Kieft, who was the Director General of the Dutch New Netherland colony. So this is Willem Kieft. And in 1640, as a way to sort of expand beyond Manhattan, he built a distillery and a buckskin tannery on Staten Island. I'm not sure why those two businesses might have been synergistic, but it was his idea. And it was very frequently raided. The Indians came and took all their peaches and then took all their pigs and then finally took all their whiskey. And at that point, the Dutch abandoned Staten Island. And then, of course, in 1664, the Dutch abandoned New Amsterdam, and under threat of getting taken over by the British, they, being good Dutch pacifists, said, go ahead, take it, we'll move on. And so one of the things that the British did with their colonies in the New World is, say, in contrast to, say, the French or the Spanish, which were out exploring, looking for fur, looking for gold, the British really wanted to build industry in the New World. And so this is a view of Brooklyn from 1766. And you can see there's nothing really on the map except for the distillery. And so this map was commissioned, this is the Ratzer map that was commissioned for the king, and in order to prove that his colonies were very useful, they were indicating that there was a lot of business and industry happening here. And so the British had colonies in the Caribbean that were growing sugarcane. It was discovered that sugar was a very efficient way to make a distilled spirit, in the case of rum. And so for the next 100 years, rum was really one of the dominant exports of New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, the Connecticut shore. There were very large commercial distilleries in the cities in those days. When the Revolutionary War happened, the American public's taste changed and got less interested in rum, which was viewed as this British colonialist drink, and got more interested in whiskey, which could be made from grain that was grown here in the United States. And the sort of epicenter of distilling shifted to the frontier, which was around Pittsburgh. And so when Alexander Hamilton proposed a whiskey tax or a spirits tax, it was the small farmers in Pennsylvania that really felt burdened by his tax, not the large commercial distilleries, which certainly existed. And it was those farmers who rebelled in the Whiskey Rebellion. And from that sort of moment forward, the whiskey tax was abandoned until the 1860s. And in 1840, there were 400,000 people living in New York City. In 1860, there's 900,000 people living in New York City. And that increase in population was mostly due to immigration, and it was a lot of Irish immigrants. And certainly Ireland has a big whiskey-making tradition. So a lot of immigrants said, well, there's potato famine here, there's religious persecution, and there's no excise tax in the United States. So if I know how to make whiskey, I'll make a lot more money if I build a distillery in Brooklyn. And so a lot of them moved to the neighborhood that we today call Vinegar Hill, which is sort of a sub-neighborhood of Dumbo, and was then called Irishtown. And one historian estimated that the distilleries there were capable of producing 5.5 million gallons of whiskey each year. By contrast, last year we made 3,000 gallons of whiskey. And this was in an age before electricity, before cars. Really, really very remarkable. Although whiskey was really the drink of choice. People didn't really drink a lot of beer back then. They didn't drink a lot of wine. And so this was all a great plan until the Civil War broke out in 1861. And in 1862, the whiskey tax came back and as an emergency wartime revenue act. And the price of whiskey went from 25 cents a gallon to $2.25 a gallon. And that drove a lot of the distillers underground, either put them out of business or forced them to do it illegally. And so that neighborhood became a hotbed of illegal distilling. And after the Civil War ended, the federal government would periodically send raids of soldiers who were based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, who would go to the neighborhood of Irishtown and destroy all the illegal stills that were there. And it became this huge sort of violent clashes between the Republicans and the Union sympathetic versus and Native people versus the immigrants, Catholic, politically, culturally, these sides were very different and took every opportunity to fight. So these raids became known as the Moonshine Wars of Brooklyn, or the Whiskey Wars of Brooklyn. They're basically forgotten to time, but they set public perception against distillers, and that had a very big impact on the future of distilling in not only New York City, but in the United States. And it gave the temperance movement a lot of traction because people started to view distillers as contributing to the delinquency of society, cheating the federal government out of tax money, and in certain cases, they were actually physically dangerous and violent. And actually, one of the revenue agents was actually shot and killed by a Brooklyn moonshiner. So things even turned bloody. So, cut to 2000. This picture's from like 2007. After Prohibition, as the temperance movement gained traction, New York City was really viewed as kind of the worst of the drinking cities, and if the temperance advocates could convince New York City to go dry, the rest of the country would probably follow, and that's essentially what happened. So Prohibition happened in 1920, didn't work for reasons we're probably all familiar with from movies, but then was repealed in 1933, and so much had changed in those 13 years, especially in New York City, that from a real estate perspective and from a commercial perspective, there was no reason to restart any of those old distilleries outside of places where there was much more infrastructure like Kentucky and Tennessee. And so after Prohibition, even states like Maryland and Indiana and Pennsylvania all had active distilling traditions, but gradually those fell away. And as little as 10 years ago, there were only about 13 commercial distilleries in the country located only in Kentucky and Tennessee. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, so I'm from a dry county in Eastern Kentucky, kind of coal mining moonshine Kentucky, not so much bourbon horse racing Kentucky. And moved to Brooklyn and then would go back to Kentucky and bring moonshine back to my apartment. And people in New York were really fascinated by this. And so I got interested in making moonshine as sort of a hobby. And as my day job, I work and continue actually to work for Bernard Shumey, who was the dean of Columbia's GSAP. So this was a way to entertain myself while avoiding architecture. And then, so after a couple of years of sort of doing this kind of moonshining hobby, my business partner, David Haskell, stepped in and said, well, why don't you, first of all, what you're doing is illegal, you're gonna get into trouble. And second of all, this is like a great business opportunity. Why not just continue to make moonshine, but do so legally? And so this is an image of when the distillery first opened. This is not only the oldest distillery in New York City, but also the smallest commercial distillery in the country. We made about 1.5 gallons of whiskey every day, and very quickly realized, not entirely sure that people would want to drink alcohol made in New York City, but very quickly realized that it probably would be successful and we would be able to kind of grow the business. There's another view. Looks really idyllic. It was actually sort of trauma after trauma in that space. But then as we were scheming to expand the business, looked at this building, which is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and this is the old Paymaster's office. And so the Navy Yard, the U.S. Navy left in 1966 and gave the land to the city of New York. And they have been sort of mismanaging for a long time, and now over the past 10 years, actively recruiting manufacturing tenants that are actually growing jobs and kind of contributing to the economy of the city. And they actually recruited us as a tenant. And so our rent was the same for this building as it was going to be for a warehouse in Darkest Bushwick. And so I'll just go through these are two historical views of the building. It was moved in 1917 for reasons, surely the Navy was busy in 1917, but they also found time to move this building. And this is the building today. This is what the downstairs looked like when we first rented the building. We tore everything. My policy for renting, or my sort of, even though I sort of have studied architecture and work in architecture, I wanted no additional architecture added, so that if anything was original to the building, it stayed and didn't even, in some cases, get painted. And if something was not original to the building, it went away. And so this is another view of during construction. And this is sort of what it looks like today. So those are our stills. Those make the whiskey. This is upstairs. There were some weird apartments that were sort of abandoned. And this is our boozeum, which is a museum of booze. This is a funny little wall. We found this wall was original to the building, but all the other walls had been torn down around it, so we just kept the wall and built some shelves around it. Here's another view. This is kind of our event space. And then outside the building, we started a little cornfield, which some of which provides corn for our process, although most of our corn comes from upstate New York. This is Charlie. This is working the stills. That's me and David. This is our barrel room, where we store all our whiskey. And this is Nicole, whose job it is to taste all the whiskey and determine its maturity. She has a very good, fun job. And then sometimes, we were just talking earlier about, this is a picture of my wedding. So we had at one point decided to host weddings. We probably won't do that anymore because it seems to interfere with making whiskey, which is what we're trying to, which is on the sort of front of our minds. So it's an interesting question now. We do have this very beautiful building that we've built, and kind of how to use it, I think, remains sort of an open question. But just to sort of sum up, I think what was really important for us in finding this building was really trying to connect to that history of whiskey making in New York City. We are steps from the whiskey wars of Brooklyn, where these historic clashes took place. Al Capone was born 400 feet from the building. He contracted syphilis on the street that runs right in front of us. So as much as people, it's kind of a way to reorient people's thinking, not just that bourbon has to come from Kentucky, but actually whiskey has a longer history in the United States and goes far beyond Kentucky, and actually is really a part of the entire American story, both urban and rural. And so to be able to connect to that through architecture, and to make that history a part of our physical location, I think is important to telling our story and helps explain to people why we're making whiskey in New York City. And so these are our whiskeys. You can find them at local liquor stores here in New York, and Connecticut, New Jersey. And that's it. Thank you very much.